This section is about the political theorists that we study in POL 111, American National Government, the three main theorists being Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. There are those out there who will say that our American democracy is uniquely American, but I beg to differ. I believe it comes around from the ideas of Europeans and how they responded to kings and royalty and the idea of divine right of kings. Let's look at the divine right of kings while we're at it. This came about from Rousseau as well as Baudin, and it's an application of Roman law justifying the king's absolute authority over both political and spiritual matters. This was the conventional wisdom of the time in Europe. By conventional wisdom, it's what everyone believes. Conventional wisdom at the time said the church, and especially the Catholic Church, was absolute. Therefore, in France, this made perfectly good sense with Louis XIV. Along came a gentleman named Martin Luther about 1517 who challenged the conventional wisdom of the Catholic Church as well as the corruption and the abuses in the selling of indulgences and said, look, there's a better way. This carried over even further. It carried over into England after the Reformation in England of Henry VIII, where he basically told the Catholic Church where to go and how long to stay there, and that he was going to do his own thing and have his own divine right of kings, that he was the head of church and state. But there were those groups that disagreed, the ideas of political descent through religion, with the Puritans in particular wanting to purify the Anglican Church of all aspects of Catholicism. This was also a time of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and therefore we have ideas coming through which is called the social contract, which is the basic agreement between the people and their leaders. It's a non-written contract. It is understood that it is this way. And this is best seen in England in 1688 following the abuses of James I and the Glorious Revolution, the role of natural law. And keep in mind, natural law also meant having people like John Locke, the contemporary of the time, theories of gravity, theories of inertia. Several ideas of natural law and science were applied to social science and how did it work. Keep in mind, the three theorists you see have to be taken in the context of the times. The political theorist I want to look at today is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes wrote towards the end of the English Civil War of the 1640s and into the 1650s, where a king such as Charles I, who used his power absolutely, and I mean he literally did things that just didn't make sense, such as suspend Parliament in 1628, enforce taxes without any representation. And Parliament got tired of him when he recalled Parliament, what they called the Rump Parliament. They just threw all of England into a tizzy, into a civil war between the Puritans and the supporters, the Cavaliers of Charles I. Well, Hobbes lived through this time, and he took the social contract as he knew it and applied it that the subjects surrender their freedom for protection from the abuses of the government. Even if the government may not be the greatest, it is still better than an abusive king. And wrote so in Leviathan that life is a state of nature that is dangerous and warlike. Very harsh times, very dark, dank. In fact, the time after, the decade after Hobbes wrote this was a time of basically the Puritans running the show, primarily through Oliver Cromwell. It is not until later years that we see the social contract brought to something we're used to seeing in the modern context. Perhaps most significant in my mind, and as well as their textbook, of all political theorists is John Locke. John Locke wrote in the late 1600s and was a contemporary of Sir Isaac Newton, who, as we all know, just came up with the idea of the theory of gravity. Locke decided to take those scientific principles, being a contemporary of Newton, and lay them out as how it worked out with social life and the social contract, and that a government cannot deprive its subjects of certain rights, and those are the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. And that if the government does not safeguard those rights, that the individuals that are governed have the right to overthrow that government, just as they did in 1688 when they overthrew King James II in the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament basically saw an abusive king, saw no way out of it, called for the next in line in the Revolution of William and Mary, and it was a peaceful revolution. But Locke has influenced so many people, in particular Thomas Jefferson. A third philosopher we need to look at wrote in the 1760s as part of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was this era where everything was questioned. it was discussed amongst the upper middle class and some of the elites, but not all the elites. And one of those gentlemen was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman who wrote about the government enacting the will of the people. In other words, talking about whatever the will of the people is, it will be carried out in the electorate or through the kings, and that people are happy and innocent in a natural state. He believed in the general will, that the government should do what the majority would like. This is a time where Louis XV, XVI were both in power in France, and as we all know how Louis XVI ended up with the French Revolution, it did not end well for him, as the monarchy in France at that time did not pay attention to the will of the people. But not least is how all these three philosophers apply to American politics. Keep in mind, America was part of the great English Empire until the 1770s. That we are an example of anti-absolutism in England, that the king and parliament as well as the prime minister all abused power in forcing taxes and trying to enforce admiralty courts and trying to enforce the will of the monarchy on the people who had already set things up on their own. A good example of this being the direct democracy in New England town hall meetings, especially under the Puritans, where everybody who was considered a citizen, which meant you were part of the church and you were also a taxpayer at the time, you were considered to be able to vote. Well, that evolved eventually and went into what's called representative democracies. The House of Burgesses in 1619 in colonial Virginia is a good example of this, and how we worry about having direct versus indirect democracy. Today we have indirect democracy and vote directly for our representatives. We don't have one person, one vote. So if we don't like what Congress says, well, this state had 560 million votes versus 460 million votes, we know what we have. We voted for an idea or a person, but not for a specific bill. Now, the question comes down, though, are the representatives acting in our best behest? That's been the long-standing question of a republic. We have a republic and not a direct democracy, as many people think.